Hey guys, tonight we be guys in place that looks peaceful from a distance, but smells like a wet goat and probably hasn't been cleaned since the invention of mud. You open your eyes slowly, expecting maybe a cozy bed, a quiet morning, perhaps even coffee. Instead, you're lying on a sack of straw that feels like it's been personally sharpened overnight. The air is cold, smoky, and oddly crunchy to breathe. Like the room itself is made of dust and disappointment. Congratulations, you've just started your day in medieval Europe. And here's the small problem. You probably won't survive it. Not because there are dragons outside or knights dramatically charging across the hills, but because the daily routine alone would absolutely destroy your modern, comfort-loving soul. Before we begin the suffering though, a quick moment. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, go ahead and comment your location and the local time where you're listening from. It's always fun seeing where in the world everyone is drifting off tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake long before the sun even considers rising. There's no alarm clock, of course. No gentle phone chime or glowing digital display. Instead, your morning is announced by a rooster somewhere outside who seems personally offended that anyone might still be sleeping. You groan quietly. The first thing you notice is the cold. Your house, if we're being generous with that word, is a small wooden hut with walls made of timber and mud plaster. Medieval peasants built homes using a technique historians call waffle and daub, which basically means weaving sticks together and covering them with a mixture of mud, straw, and sometimes animal dung. It's surprisingly effective until winter arrives. Then the wind politely walks straight through the walls like it owns the place. You sit up slowly, brushing straw from your hair. The bed you slept on is nothing more than a cloth sack stuffed with dried grass. Sometimes medieval mattresses were filled with straw, feathers, or even leaves, but over time the material flattened into something that feels less like a mattress and more like a lumpy suggestion of comfort. And yes, there are probably insects living in it. Historians studying medieval households often mention fleas, lice, and bedbugs as common companions. So as you rub your eyes awake, there's a decent chance a few tiny roommates are already enjoying breakfast. Not exactly the luxury hotel experience. The room around you is dim, lit only by the faint grey light sneaking through a narrow window hole. Glass windows are rare in peasant homes because glass is expensive, so most openings are simply covered with wooden shutters or cloth, which means fresh air is optional. The air inside smells faintly of smoke, damp straw, and yesterday's cooking fire. That fire sits in the middle of the room, in a shallow pit, still smouldering from the night before. Most peasant houses didn't have chimneys, so the smoke from the fire slowly drifts upward and eventually escapes through a hole in the roof. Eventually. Until then, it just politely fills the room. If your eyes sting a little, that's normal. You stretch your stiff back and glance around the room. Your entire household is still asleep nearby. Medieval families often shared one or two rooms, sometimes with multiple people sleeping together for warmth. Privacy, as a concept, is not particularly popular in this century. Near the doorway, you hear a soft, snuffling sound. That would be the goat, or possibly the pig. Animals often slept inside peasant homes during colder months, not because farmers were unusually affectionate toward livestock, but because animals produce heat, and heat is extremely valuable when your walls are basically made of decorated mud. Plus, keeping animals indoors protects them from thieves and wolves. Outside, the rooster crows again, louder this time, clearly proud of himself. You sigh. It's time to start the day. Medieval peasants typically woke before sunrise because daylight was the most valuable working resource they had. Without electricity or bright artificial lighting, most labor had to be done while the sun was up, which meant mornings started painfully early. Historians estimate that many peasants worked around 10 to 12 hours a day, depending on the season. During harvest time, the workdays could stretch even longer. You stand up slowly, feeling the cold floor beneath your feet. Shoes are nearby, simple leather things that look sturdy but slightly suspicious. Footwear in the medieval world wasn't always comfortable or long-lasting, so most people wore them until they practically dissolved. You pull them on anyway, because stepping outside barefoot into a medieval village is not recommended. Outside your door lies a small settlement of similar huts clustered around a muddy path. The village probably holds a few dozen families, all living under the authority of a nearby lord who technically owns most of the land you'll be working today. But that unpleasant reality can wait a little longer. For now, you open the wooden door and step outside into the early morning air. Mist hangs low over the fields beyond the village. The ground beneath your feet is damp, uneven, and already turning to mud. Medieval roads were rarely paved outside major cities, so villages often became muddy obstacle courses whenever it rained, which, in medieval Europe, happened quite a lot. A thin column of smoke rises from a neighbor's house as someone else wakes and stirs their cooking fire. Another rooster joins the chorus. A dog barks lazily somewhere near the edge of the village. And slowly, as the pale light of dawn spreads across the horizon, the medieval world begins to wake up. You take a deep breath of cold morning air. It smells like wet soil, animals, and distant wood smoke. Charming. But this quiet moment won't last long, because in just a little while, you'll be heading to the fields for a full day of back-breaking labor. And if you're already tired, well, remember, the day has barely begun. You stand there for a moment in the cold dawn, hoping just briefly that breakfast might somehow appear out of nowhere. Maybe a warm plate of eggs, a little fruit, possibly coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Instead, you step back inside the smoky hut where reality is waiting. Your morning meal is sitting near the fire pit, wrapped in a small cloth. It's bread. Just bread. And not the fluffy golden kind that modern bakeries proudly display behind shiny glass windows. This loaf is dense, dark, and heavy enough that you briefly consider using it as a defensive weapon. Medieval bread was usually made from coarse grains like barley or rye, especially for peasants. Wheat bread, the soft white kind, was considered a luxury and often reserved for wealthier people. So the loaf you're holding right now, it's a little rough. Actually, it's very rough. Historians studying medieval diets have even found traces of tiny stone particles in bread remains from the time. That's because grain was ground using large stone mills, and sometimes little bits of the grinding stone mixed into the flour, which means people were occasionally eating microscopic rocks with breakfast. Great for dental work if medieval dentistry had existed. You break off a piece and chew slowly. It's dry, extremely dry, but you're hungry, so it works. To help wash it down, there's a wooden mug sitting beside the bread. Inside is a cloudy liquid that smells faintly sour. Ale. Before you panic, don't worry. It's not the strong kind served in modern pubs. Medieval small ale was a very weak alcoholic drink, often safer to drink than water because the brewing process killed many harmful bacteria. Historians generally agree that people of all ages drank it regularly, including children. So yes, technically, you're starting the day with alcohol, but it's more like lightly fermented bread water than anything wild. You take a sip. It's flat, slightly bitter, and surprisingly refreshing after the dry bread. Breakfast in medieval Europe was often simple, like this, especially for peasants. Meals focused on basic grains, vegetables, and occasionally dairy if a household kept animals like goats or cows. Meat, on the other hand, was rare. Contrary to what movies sometimes show, peasants didn't regularly feast on roasted chickens or giant legs of lamb. Meat was expensive and usually saved for special occasions or religious festivals. Most of the time, the diet was built around grains, porridge, beans, onions, and cabbage. Exciting stuff. Still chewing your bread, you glance toward the doorway again. The sky outside has brightened slightly, turning from dark blue to pale grey. The village is slowly coming alive. You hear the creak of another door opening nearby, followed by someone coughing loudly in the cold air. A cartwheel squeaks somewhere down the path, and a few chickens wander past your doorway like tiny feathered supervisors checking everyone's attendance. You finish the last piece of bread and brush crumbs from your hands. The day is officially starting now. Before leaving the house, though, you grab a simple wool cloak hanging near the wall. Medieval clothing was typically made from wool or linen, and while wool is excellent for warmth, it's not exactly soft. The cloak scratches slightly against your neck as you wrap it around your shoulders. Fashion in the medieval world tends to focus more on survival than comfort. Outside, the village path is now busier. A woman carrying a wooden bucket walks toward the well at the center of the settlement. Two boys chase a stubborn goose across the muddy road, while an older man slowly leads a donkey, pulling a small cart loaded with tools. Everyone has somewhere to be. In medieval society, most villagers were peasants working land owned by a lord under the feudal system. That meant farmers were required to spend several days each week working the lord's fields rather than their own. Historians still debate exactly how strict these obligations were in different regions, but many peasants owed both labor and a portion of their harvest to their local lord, which means a good part of your work today won't even benefit you directly. Fun system. You step carefully along the muddy path, trying to avoid the deeper puddles. That proves difficult. Medieval villages didn't have proper sewage systems, and people often dumped waste outside their homes or into shallow ditches. Over time, the mixture of mud, straw, manure, and general village debris formed a surface that historians politely describe as organic. A more accurate description might be extremely squishy. You nearly slip once before regaining your balance. Nearby, a pig trots confidently through the mud, as if it's the mayor of the entire village. Which, honestly, it might be. Animals wander freely in many medieval villages, searching for scraps and leftover food. Pigs were especially common because they could eat almost anything and required very little care. That includes, unfortunately, things you'd rather not think about. A faint church bell rings somewhere in the distance. The sound drifts across the fields and through the village streets, echoing softly in the cold morning air. Church bells played a huge role in medieval daily life. Without clocks, bells helped signal important moments of the day: prayer times, work hours, and gatherings. Religion shaped nearly every aspect of medieval society. Even your work schedule. You pause for a moment, listening to the bell. For a brief second, the village feels peaceful. Mist still lingers above the distant farmland, and the rising sun paints the horizon with pale gold light. It's actually kind of beautiful. But that peaceful feeling fades quickly when you remember what comes next. Because in just a few minutes, you'll be heading out to the fields. And medieval farming is not exactly known for being relaxing. You leave the last cluster of village huts behind and follow the narrow track that winds between them. Calling it a road would be generous. It's more like a long strip of mud that people and animals have politely agreed to share. Your boots sink slightly with each step. Squish, step, squish again. The ground is damp from last night's dew, and in a few spots the mud is deep enough to swallow the edges of your shoes. Medieval villages rarely had paved streets. Stone roads existed in larger towns or leftover Roman routes, but most small settlements made do with dirt paths that slowly turned into brown soup whenever it rained, which was often. As you walk, you begin noticing more of the morning activity around you. A man up ahead is hauling 2 wooden buckets balanced across a pole resting on his shoulders. Water from the village wells slushes slightly with each step. Water collection was a daily task for many households, and depending on the size of the village, that well might serve dozens of families. Historians point out that medieval wells were incredibly important gathering places. They weren't just for water, they were social hubs. News spread there. Gossip flourished there. If someone in the village had done something embarrassing, the well probably knew about it first. To your right, a pair of women stand near a doorway, shaking out cloth blankets and talking quietly. Their voices drift across the path in low conversation while chickens scratch around their feet, pecking enthusiastically at the ground. Chickens, goats, pigs, and sometimes cows wander freely through medieval villages. There are no fences separating most homes, and animals roam wherever they please. One chicken crosses directly in front of you. You pause to let it pass. Because in this time period, the chicken has right of way. A small dog trots along behind it, sniffing everything with intense dedication. Dogs in medieval villages were rarely pampered pets like modern ones. They were working animals used for guarding homes, hunting small game, or chasing away pests. Although judging by this one's relaxed pace, pest control is probably not high on today's to-do list. You keep walking. Ahead, the path widens slightly near a shallow ditch running alongside the road. A murky stream of water trickles through it, carrying bits of straw and other things you'd rather not identify. Drainage systems in medieval villages were simple. Many settlements used open ditches to carry waste and rainwater away from homes. In theory, the system worked. In practice, well, it smelled. Historians studying medieval sanitation often point out that people did understand the importance of cleanliness to some degree, but without modern plumbing, Waste disposal relied heavily on pits, ditches, and occasionally dumping things outside the village. Sometimes very close to the village, you catch a faint smell drifting from the ditch and decide it's best to keep moving. The morning air is still cool, and the mist hanging over the fields beyond the village blows faintly in the growing sunlight. In the distance, you can see long strips of farmland stretching across the landscape. These fields are divided into narrow sections, each belonging to different farmers or controlled by the local lord. This arrangement is part of something historians call the open field system, a common agricultural setup in medieval Europe. Instead of each farmer owning one large fenced plot, land was divided into long strips, scattered across large communal fields, which means your farmland might not even be next to your neighbour's farmland. Everyone worked pieces of land spread throughout the area. Historians still debate whether this system improved cooperation or simply made farming more complicated. But one thing is certain, it required a lot of coordination between villagers. You pass the village well now, where a small group of people has already gathered. Buckets clank softly against the stone rim as someone lowers a rope into the darkness. A boy nearby struggles to carry a bucket that's clearly too heavy for him. Water sloshes onto his shoes. He sighs dramatically. Some things, it seems, never change across centuries. You continue down the path toward the open fields. The houses grow fewer behind you, replaced by small gardens and fenced vegetable patches. These little plots are important because they provide extra food for families, things like cabbage, onions, peas, and herbs. Medieval gardens were surprisingly practical. One quirky historical detail: people sometimes planted strong-smelling herbs like lavender, mint, or sage near their homes, not just for cooking, but also to help mask unpleasant odors drifting from nearby animals or waste pits. Essentially, medieval air fresheners. Ahead of you, a wooden cart creaks along the path, pulled slowly by a large ox. The animal moves with calm patience, each step heavy but steady. Oxen were incredibly valuable in medieval farming. While horses were faster, oxen were stronger and more reliable for pulling plows through heavy soil. A well-trained ox team could prepare fields far more efficiently than human labor alone. You walk alongside the cart for a moment, listening to the steady creak of its wooden wheels. The man guiding the ox nods briefly in greeting. No long conversation. Mornings are busy. Beyond the last hedgerow, the farmland opens up completely. Wide strips of soil stretch across gentle hills, some freshly ploughed, others still waiting for work. A few scattered figures already moving across the fields, small shapes bending and lifting tools in the early sunlight. The workday has begun. You stop at the edge of the field and take a slow breath. From a distance, the countryside looks peaceful rolling land, soft morning light, birds gliding quietly across the sky. But standing here now, looking at the endless rows of soil that need tending, one thing becomes very clear. This peaceful landscape is about to demand a full day of exhausting labor, and your hands, your back, and your patience are about to learn exactly why medieval farming had a reputation for being brutally hard work. You step forward into the field, the mud grips your boots again, and the long day truly begins. You step out into the field, and the first thing you notice is how wide everything feels. The village behind you now looks small, just a cluster of crooked rooftops and thin smoke trails rising into the morning sky. Out here, the land stretches in long strips across the hills, each one carefully cultivated and maintained by different families. This is where most of your day will happen. The soil beneath your boots is dark and slightly damp, perfect for farming if the weather stays kind. Medieval farmers depended heavily on good soil and good weather, because there were no chemical fertilizers, no tractors, and certainly no weather apps warning you about storms. Just hope, experience, and a lot of hard work. Up ahead, a few other villagers are already busy. One man pushes a wooden plough through the soil, while two oxen pull it forward slowly. Another farmer walks behind with a sack slung over his shoulder, scattering seeds by hand. The movements are slow but steady. There's a rhythm to it. You approach the tools stacked near the edge of the field. Simply wooden handles fitted with iron blades, hoes, spades, and digging sticks. Nothing fancy. In fact, most medieval farming tools were remarkably basic. Historians note that many of these tools changed very little for centuries. A wooden plough with an iron tip could still break soil effectively, even if it required more physical effort than modern machines. which means today, unfortunately, that physical effort will mostly come from you. You pick up a hoe. It's heavier than it looks. The wooden handle is smooth from years of use, polished by countless hands gripping it through endless seasons of planting and harvesting. Someone nearby gestures toward a patch of soil that needs clearing. No formal instructions, no orientation video, just start working. You step into the row and raise the hoe for the first time. Swing. The blade sinks into the soil with a dull thud. You pull it back, breaking apart a clump of dirt. Then again. Swing. Thud. At first it seems manageable. The movements are simple: lift, swing, pull, repeat. But after several minutes you begin to notice something. This work never stops. There's no quick shortcut or clever trick to make it easier. Every patch of soil must be turned by hand. Every weed must be removed manually. Your arms begin to warm up, then your shoulders, then your lower back quietly begins filing complaints with the management. Medieval farming was physically demanding, and peasants often started helping with field work from a young age. By adulthood, many farmers had strong bodies shaped by years of manual labor. Modern gym memberships were not required. Historians studying skeletal remains from medieval villages often find evidence of joint strain and repetitive stress injuries. Farming tools may have been simple, but using them hour after hour took a serious toll on the body. After about 15 minutes, you understand why. You swing the hoe again and pause to stretch your back slightly. The sun has climbed a little higher now, warming the air just enough to make the work more comfortable. A light breeze moves across the field, carrying the smell of damp earth and crushed grass. It's peaceful in a quiet way. Birds circle overhead, occasionally diving down to search for insects in the freshly turned soil. In fact, farmers sometimes welcomed birds during ploughing because they hoped to control pests by eating insects hiding underground. A small flock lands nearby, hopping along the furrows like tiny inspectors checking your progress. You keep working. Swing. Break the soil. Pull. Step forward. Repeat. A few rows over, the man guiding the oxen adjusts the plough as the animals move slowly forward. Oxen were incredibly important in medieval agriculture because they were strong enough to pull heavy ploughs through dense soil. Interestingly, historians still debate exactly how efficient oxen were compared to horses. Horses were faster but required better food and more care, while oxen were slower but much sturdier. In many villages, oxen were the practical choice. Plus, they were less likely to panic if something unexpected happened, which, in medieval farming, happened often. As you continue working, the rhythm of the field settles around you. Metal tools strike soil. Oxen hooves press into the earth. Wind moves softly through distant trees. Somewhere nearby, someone starts humming a slow tune while they work. It's quiet and repetitive, the kind of melody that keeps time with simple tasks. Work songs like this were common throughout history. Singing while working helped people maintain rhythm and pass the time during long hours of labor. You consider joining in, but you're slightly out of breath already. The hoe rises and falls again. And again. Slowly, you begin to understand something important about medieval life. Most of it looked exactly like this. Long stretches of physical work, broken only by short rests and simple meals. Day after day, season after season. There were celebrations, festivals, and holidays occasionally, of course. Medieval calendars included many religious feast days where people could rest and gather. But for most of the year, survival depended on the steady, exhausting rhythm of farming. The sun climbs higher, your shoulders ache, and the row of soil in front of you still stretches farther than you'd like. You pause for a moment, leaning slightly on the handle of the hoe. Then you take a breath, because if you want to eat this winter, the field isn't going to prepare itself. The first hour of work passes slowly, not dramatically. Not heroically, just slowly, the way time moves when your arms are already tired and the row of soil in front of you refuses to shrink at the speed you'd prefer. You swing the hoe again. Thud. The iron blade bites into the ground, lifting another stubborn clump of dirt. Your hand slides slightly along the wooden handle, and you tighten your grip before raising it again. Swing. Thud. At first it was almost peaceful. The quiet morning, the birds circling above the fields, the soft breeze drifting across the farmland. Now your shoulders are beginning to argue with you. This is the moment modern visitors to the medieval world usually realize something important. Farming tools may be simple, but they demand constant effort. You stop briefly and glance down at your hands. A faint redness is already forming along your palms. Blisters are coming. Medieval farmers often wrapped cloth around their hands or developed thick calluses after years of work. But since you arrived here just a few hours ago, congratulations, you get to experience the beginner version of medieval agriculture. And it hurts. Nearby, another farmer works steadily with a spade, turning the soil in long, practiced motions. His movements are smooth and efficient, the result of years spent doing the same task day after day. He barely pauses. You, on the other hand, pause every few minutes pretending to inspect the soil. It's a solid strategy. Unfortunately, the soil inspection never ends. Across the field, the oxen pulling the plough continue their slow march forward. The plough cuts long lines through the earth, creating neat furrows ready for planting. Each pass reveals darker soil beneath the surface, moist and rich with nutrients. Historians often credit the heavy plough introduced widely in medieval Europe around the early Middle Ages as one of the tools that helped expand farming into northern regions with tougher soil. It was a major agricultural development. Unfortunately, someone still had to walk behind it all day, guiding the animals. So even the advanced technology of the time came with plenty of sweat. You lean forward again and continue working your row. Swing, break the soil, pull the weeds, step forward, repeat. The sun climbs steadily above the horizon, warming the field with golden light. The early morning chill is fading now, replaced by a gentle warmth that makes the work slightly easier. For a while. Then the sweat starts. At first it's just a little warmth along your back, then your forehead joins the conversation. Soon your cloak feels too heavy, so you shrug it off and leave it folded near the edge of the field. This is the point where medieval workers often settled into a steady rhythm for the long morning stretch. Farming wasn't done in short bursts. It required hours of consistent effort. Historians estimate that peasants often worked from sunrise until sunset during busy seasons like planting and harvest. That could easily mean 10 or more hours in the fields. You pause again, stretching your back and glancing around. The landscape is surprisingly beautiful when you stop to look. Rolling farmland spreads across the hills in long stripes of green and brown. Beyond the fields, a line of trees marks the edge of a forest, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. A hawk circles high above the countryside. For a moment everything feels calm, then your stomach growls. That tiny breakfast of bread and ale is no longer holding its ground. Medieval diets were heavily based on grains and vegetables, which provided energy but sometimes lacked variety. Meat was rare for peasants, though occasionally small animals like rabbits or chickens might appear on the table during special meals. Most of the time, though, it was bread, porridge, beans, and cabbage. Lots of cabbage. One curious historical detail: medieval people often ate a thick vegetable stew called pottage. This dish was basically whatever vegetables and grains were available, boiled together in a pot that might stay on the fire for days. New ingredients were simply added as the stew simmered. It was efficient, but if you're imagining a soup that's been cooking continuously for 3 days, well, yes, that's essentially the idea. You wipe your forehead and return to the row. Swing. Thud. The soil breaks apart again. Over time, the work starts to become strangely hypnotic. The repeated motion settles into a slow rhythm, almost like breathing. Lift. Swing. Step forward. The field gradually changes behind you. Soil once packed tight now lies loose and ready for planting. A flock of birds hops across the freshly turned ground, pecking eagerly at worms uncovered by your work. In a strange way, you've just opened a buffet for them. Nature wastes no time. Somewhere nearby, the man with the oxen calls out softly to guide the animals around a turn. The wooden plough creaks as it shifts direction, carving another long furrow into the earth. The day continues, and the field keeps asking for more. You pause one more time and glance at the horizon. The sun is still climbing, which means morning isn't even halfway finished yet. Your arms ache, your back protests, and there's a growing realization slowly settling in your mind. If this is just the first few hours of the day, the rest of medieval life might be even harder than you expected. You straighten up slowly, stretching your back while leaning on the handle of the hoe. For a brief moment, you stare across the wide fields and let your arms rest. It's quiet except for the steady sounds of work. Metal tools striking soil, oxen breathing slowly as they pull the plough. wind brushing softly through the grass. But even while everyone works, there's an invisible system shaping every movement out here. The land you're standing on? Technically, it doesn't belong to you. Welcome to the medieval feudal system, one of the defining social structures of the Middle Ages. In simple terms, the land belongs to a lord and noble who controls the manor, the fields, and the village surrounding them. In exchange for living and farming here, peasants owe the lord both labor and goods, which means a portion of everything grown in these fields will eventually go to someone else's table. Historians still argue about how fair or unfair this arrangement really was, depending on the region and time period. Some lords were relatively reasonable, while others squeezed every possible resource from the people working their land. But one thing was consistent: the peasants did the work. You wipe a little dirt from your hands and glance across the field again. Some of the strips of land here belong to individual families where they grow food for themselves. But several sections, especially the larger ones closer to the center of the field, are part of the Lord's demesne, meaning they're farmed specifically for the Lord's household. And today, you're working one of those sections. So while your arms are getting tired preparing this soil, the harvest won't even belong to you. That realization hits with the gentle, emotional weight of a medieval tax collector. Still, complaining isn't exactly productive, so you return to your row and keep working. Swing. Thud. The soil loosens again. Across the field, a few villagers have gathered near a wooden cart loaded with sacks of grain from last season. They're measuring out portions carefully, possibly preparing a rent payment owed to the Lord or the church. Because, yes, there's another layer. In addition to working the Lord's land, peasants were often required to give a tithe to the local church, typically around 10% of their produce. Historians note that this religious tax helped support churches, clergy, and community services. But when harvests were poor, that 10% could feel like a lot more. You lean forward again and continue clearing weeds from the row. Your hands move automatically now, pulling stubborn roots from the soil. Some weeds slide out easily, others cling tightly, forcing you to dig deeper with the blade of the hoe. Weeds were a constant battle in medieval farming. Without modern herbicides or advanced tools, the only way to control them was manual labor. Farmers and their families often spent countless hours pulling unwanted plants so crops could grow properly. And if weeds spread too far, they could ruin an entire harvest, which meant hunger later in the year. A breeze moves across the field, carrying the warm scent of soil and crushed grass. The sun now sits comfortably above the horizon, lighting the countryside with soft gold. From here, you can see the edge of the village again. The small huts look peaceful from this distance. Smoke rises lazily from a few rooftops, and tiny figures move along the muddy paths between homes. Life there seems calm compared to the endless rows of work out here. A crow lands on a fence post nearby and watches the farmers with suspicious interest. Crows were common sights in medieval farmland, sometimes welcomed because they ate insects and pests. Other times they were chased away because they also enjoyed eating newly planted seeds. In fact, some villages used scarecrows, simple wooden figures dressed in old clothes, to frighten birds away from crops. Historians debate how effective these early scarecrows really were, but they definitely looked impressive standing in the fields. You glance around, half expecting to see one nearby. Instead, the crow simply tilts its head and stares at you like it's judging your farming technique. Which, honestly, it might be. Your shoulders ache again. You roll them slightly and keep working. Swing. Break the soil. Pull the weeds. Step forward. The rhythm continues. Over time, medieval peasants became experts at this kind of labor. They knew the soil, the seasons, and the patterns of weather better than anyone else. When to plant. When to harvest. When to pray for rain. Generations of farmers passed this knowledge down through experience rather than books, and sometimes that knowledge included unusual traditions. For example, in some medieval communities, farmers believed planting crops during certain phases of the moon improved growth. Historians still debate whether this belief had any real effect, but the practice appeared in farming traditions across Europe. Old habits stick around when your survival depends on good harvests. You pause again, looking at the progress you've made. Your row is finally starting to look respectable. The soil lies soft and broken, ready for seeds later in the season. But there's still more field ahead, and the sun is still climbing, which means the medieval workday is only getting started. By the time the sun climbs higher into the sky, Your stomach has begun reminding you that the small piece of bread from earlier was not exactly a heroic breakfast. At first, the hunger was just a quiet suggestion. Now it's becoming a full conversation. You pause again in the row, leaning slightly on the hoe, while looking across the fields. The farmland stretches endlessly, dotted with farmers working in slow, steady movements. Everyone is still busy. No lunch bells, no scheduled breaks, just work. Medieval peasants typically ate two main meals during the day. Breakfast was small if it happened at all, and the larger meal came later in the afternoon. That meant long stretches of labor between meals, especially during busy seasons, which explains why your stomach is currently protesting. You return to your work, though the rhythm now feels heavier. Swing. Thud. The soil breaks apart again. Pull a weed. Step forward. The breeze across the field has warmed slightly, carrying the smell of earth and growing plants. It's pleasant in a quiet way, but the sun now rests high enough to start warming your shoulders. Sweat forms again along your forehead. You wipe it away with the back of your sleeve. Across the field, one of the farmers kneels beside a small sack of seeds and begins scattering them carefully along the furrows. The seeds fall in gentle arcs, disappearing into the freshly turned soil. Planting like this required careful timing. If seeds were planted too early, frost might destroy them. Too late, and the growing season might be too short for a full harvest. Historians note that medieval farmers relied heavily on seasonal knowledge passed down through generations. Without scientific tools or weather forecasts, experience was the most valuable farming guide. Sometimes the weather cooperated, sometimes it didn't, and when harvests failed, things became dangerous. Medieval famines were not uncommon, especially when poor weather damaged crops across large regions. A few bad harvests in a row could lead to widespread hunger. One famous example occurred during the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, when heavy rains ruined crops across much of northern Europe. Food shortages became so severe that many villages struggled simply to survive. Historians still debate exactly how many people died during that period, but it left a lasting mark on medieval society. Standing here in the field now, watching farmers carefully plant each seed, it's easy to understand why every harvest mattered. Your hoe strikes the soil again. Thud. A stubborn root refuses to move. You dig deeper and finally pull it free. A small clump of dirt flies off to the side. Nearby, one of the farmers laughs quietly at something another worker says. Their voices drift across the field in casual conversation. Even during hard labor, people found ways to talk and joke while working. A little humor helped pass the hours. You glance toward them briefly before returning to your row. Another bird swoops down to investigate the freshly disturbed soil. It hops along the ground, pecking enthusiastically at insects uncovered by your work. Birds were constant companions in medieval farmland. Some were helpful, others were thieves. Crows and sparrows sometimes stole seeds before they had a chance to grow, which could frustrate farmers who had already spent hours preparing the soil. This is why scarecrows appeared in many fields. Simple wooden frames dressed in old clothing, standing silently among the crops like strange guardians of the harvest. Historians still argue whether birds were actually frightened by these figures or simply ignored them after a while. Birds, it seems, are not easily impressed. You stretch your arms again. Your shoulders ache more now, and your hands are starting to feel tender. The skin along your palms has warmed enough that those earlier red spots are beginning to turn into proper blisters. Congratulations. You are officially developing medieval farmer hands. A breeze drifts through the field again, offering a brief moment of relief. You pause, breathing slowly, and look toward the horizon. The countryside is peaceful, in a way that's difficult to describe. Rolling fields, distant forests, and the occasional farmhouse scattered across the land. If someone saw this view from far away, they might imagine a quiet, simple life. And in some ways it was. But standing here, with tired arms and a hungry stomach, the reality becomes clearer. Simple did not mean easy. Medieval life demanded constant work, constant patience, and a willingness to endure long days like this one. You lift the hoe again, swing, break the soil, step forward. The sun moves slowly across the sky, and somewhere in the distance, faintly carried by the wind, the church bell rings again, marking another hour passing in the long rhythm of medieval life. Eventually, the morning work slows just enough for people to step away from the rows of soil. No one announces a formal break, but the rhythm of the field softens as farmers straighten their backs, stretch their arms, and walk slowly toward the edges of the land. You follow along, grateful for the excuse to stop swinging the hoe. Your shoulders feel stiff now, and your hands are starting to notice every tiny movement. The blisters forming along your palms have fully introduced themselves. Welcome to medieval manual labor. A few farmers sit on low stones or overturned baskets near the edge of the field. Others lean against the wooden cart that brought tools earlier this morning. This isn't exactly a lunch break, yet more like a moment to breathe. You step toward the cart and rest your hands on the rough wooden side. The wood feels warm now after sitting in the sun, and the faint smell of old grain lingers in the air. From here, you can see the village again in the distance. Smoke curls upward from several rooftops, and tiny figures move slowly along the paths between houses. The settlement looks peaceful from this distance, almost quiet and comfortable. But you already know the inside of those homes tells a different story. After a few minutes of rest, you decide to walk back toward the village briefly. It's not far, just a short path between the fields and the small cluster of houses. Farmers often returned home during breaks to check on animals, gather supplies, or simply drink water. Your legs move slowly at first, adjusting after the hours of repetitive work. The muddy path greets you again as you step away from the farmland. The ground squishes under your boots with the same familiar sound. Squish, step, squish again. The village feels more alive now than it did at dawn. Chickens wander confidently across the paths, pecking at anything that might resemble food. A pair of goats stand near a doorway, chewing something that might have once been part of a broom. Nearby, a woman kneels beside a wooden tub filled with water, scrubbing cloth garments against a rough washing board. Laundry in the medieval world required a lot of patience and arm strength. Historians note that washing clothes often involved boiling water with ash or lye soap before scrubbing fabrics clean by hand. It was slow, messy work, but necessary if you wanted clothing to last longer than a few weeks. You pass a small vegetable garden beside one of the houses. Rows of cabbage, onions, and herbs grow neatly inside a low wooden fence. These small household gardens were extremely important because they supplemented the larger fields. If crops in the open fields failed, vegetables grown near the house might still provide enough food to survive the season. Medieval families depended on every possible food source. The smell drifting through the village air now is different from the damp soil of the fields. It's warmer. Wood smoke, cooking grains, and the faint earthy scent of animals all mixed together. Not unpleasant, just strong. You glance toward the open doorway of a nearby house and catch a glimpse inside. The room is dim and filled with the familiar haze of smoke from a small cooking fire. A pot hangs over the flames, slowly bubbling as something thick cooks inside, most likely pottage, that thick vegetable stew you heard about earlier. A quirky detail historians love to mention is that medieval cooking pots sometimes remained on the fire for days. New vegetables, grains, or herbs were simply added as the stew simmered, which means every bowl contained a small history of previous meals. It was efficient, but also a little mysterious. You continue along the path until you reach the village well. Several people stand nearby now, lowering buckets and pulling them back up again with steady effort. Water splashes gently against the stone rim as someone lifts a full bucket onto the ground. The well is busy. As historians often point out, these places were more than water sources, they were information centers. Two women talk quietly while filling their buckets. A boy sits nearby tying a loose rope knot around a handle. Someone laughs softly at a story being told. Village life may have been difficult, but people still found time for conversation and small moments of community. You step closer to the well and lower a wooden cup attached to a rope. The water below looks dark and cool. A few seconds later, you pull the cup back up and take a long drink. The water is cold and refreshing after the dusty air of the fields. You wipe your mouth and glance toward the farmland again. The sun sits higher now. Your short rest is nearly over, because out there, the rows of soil are still waiting. And medieval farming, unfortunately, doesn't finish itself while you're chatting at the well. You set the cup down and begin walking back toward the fields. Your arms are already remembering the work, and a day is only halfway done. You leave the well behind and begin the slow walk back toward the fields. Your short break helped a little. Your shoulders feel slightly looser, and the cool water has quieted your complaining stomach for now. But the moment the farmland comes back into view, you remember exactly what's waiting. Rows of soil. Endless rows of soil. The farmers who rested near the cart earlier are already back at work. From a distance, they look almost like part of the landscape. Small figures, bending, lifting tools, and moving steadily across the fields. There's a quiet determination in the way everyone works, because here in medieval life, the crops aren't optional, they are survival. You step back into your row and pick up the hoe again. Your hands notice immediately. The blisters that formed earlier have become more sensitive, and the wooden handle presses against them with each movement. Swing. Thud. You break the soil again. A few birds hop across the furrows nearby, clearly pleased with your return. The freshly disturbed ground reveals plenty of insects, and they take full advantage of the buffet. But birds weren't the only creatures farmers had to worry about. Animals often wandered into fields looking for easy meals. Deer, rabbits, wild pigs, and even goats from nearby villages could destroy crops quickly if left unattended. Historians studying medieval farming practices often mention simple wooden fences, hedges, and watch duties used to protect crops. In some places, villagers even took turns guarding fields during critical growing periods, because one hungry herd of animals could undo weeks of work overnight. You pull another stubborn weed from the soil and toss it aside. Across the field, the man guiding the oxen has reached the far edge of the land. He pauses briefly, turning the heavy plough around for another pass. The oxen move slowly, but obediently, their large hooves pressing deep into the soft earth. Interestingly, medieval farmers often valued oxen for their calm nature as much as their strength. Horses were faster, but oxen were steadier when pulling heavy loads. And they ate simpler food. In a farming economy where every resource mattered, practicality usually won. The plough creaks as it cuts another long furrow into the field. You continue your work. Swing, break the soil, step forward, pull another weed. The sun now sits well above the horizon, and the warmth of the day is beginning to settle across the countryside. The air smells richer, now warm earth, grass, and distant wood smoke drifting from the village. Sweat forms along your forehead again. You wipe it away and pause for a moment. Something catches your eye near the edge of the field. A small wooden figure stands among the crops a few rows away. At first glance, it looks like a person standing perfectly still. Then you notice the stiff arms, the floppy hat, the loose shirt hanging awkwardly from a wooden frame. A scarecrow. Its purpose is simple: convince birds that a human is standing guard in the field. Historians still debate exactly how effective scarecrows were. Some birds avoided them at first, but many quickly realized the silent figure never moved, which meant the illusion didn't always last long. Still, the scarecrow stands there faithfully, guarding the crops in its own quiet way. A crow lands nearby and tilts its head at the wooden figure. Apparently, the crow is not convinced. You return to your row again. Swing. Thud. Your arms feel heavier now. The rhythm that once felt steady is becoming slower. Each movement requires just a little more effort than before. This is the part of the workday where endurance matters. Medieval farmers didn't rely on bursts of energy. They relied on persistence, working steadily for long hours without stopping completely. It was less about speed, more about lasting the entire day. You pause and stretch your back again. From here, you can see the distant forest lining the edge of the farmland. Dark green trees rise along the horizon, their branches moving gently in the afternoon breeze. Forests were incredibly important resources in medieval society. They provided wood for building homes, fuel for fires, and sometimes wild animals for hunting. But many forests were also controlled by lords, and hunting in them without permission could be illegal. In some regions, poaching animals from a lord's forest carried serious penalties. Historians still argue about how strictly these forest laws were enforced in everyday life, but one thing is clear: most peasants didn't take the risk lightly. You glance back at the row in front of you. Still more soil, still more weeds, still more work. The day stretches forward slowly, and as the sun climbs higher overhead, you begin to understand something else about medieval life.